This program is provided by Universal Genesis.
Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going deep, really deep, into a pretty surprising argument from geopolitical history. The idea that specific theological beliefs, particularly those forged during the Reformation, didn't just clash with science. No, they actually helped build the scientific and logistical framework for the modern military, and down the line, the modern economy itself.
That's exactly right. We're looking at sources today that really focus on the religious wars, the 16th and 17th centuries. And our mission, essentially, is to figure out why science, engineering, and institutional innovation seem to just take off and really embed themselves first in Protestant areas. Think the Dutch Republic, Sweden, Northern Germany, and how that gave them a decisive edge over the traditional Catholic power center, the Holy Roman Empire. We'll call it the HRE. It's about connecting these spiritual differences directly to survival, geopolitics, and eventually long-term economic strength.
Okay, let's unpack that straight away, because the HRE, it's crucial to get what that actually was. It wasn't like France or England, a unified state. It was this huge, sprawling, nominal empire.
Yeah.
Really a decentralized collection of hundreds of little principalities, all sort of pledging loyalty to a Habsburg emperor.
Yeah.
And into that complicated map, suddenly science and math become, weapons you need to survive.
Exactly. And the key to using those weapons effectively was philosophical acceptance. In those Protestant regions, there was this core shift in thinking that, honestly, changed everything. Our sources bring up Max Weber's ideas here on Baruf, the idea of a vocational mission and rational diligence.
Right. Explain how that's different, because the standard medieval view, especially in the Catholic world, often saw work, technical stuff as necessary, but even penance. But the real high-status activity, the truly spiritual path, was contemplation or prayer, wasn't it?
Precisely. That's the critical point. In these reformed areas, work, scientific study. It stopped being just some secondary secular thing. It got reframed as a direct act of faith, a calling, studying nature, math, physics. That wasn't seen as against faith. No, it was fulfilling your duty, your vocation to understand God's creative order. You weren't just, say, building a better cannon. You were applying God-given reason to grasp the divine mechanics of the world.
So that acceptance baked into the philosophy meant that when the religious wars kicked off, and these wars demanded huge technical and logistical efforts, math and physics were already seen as compatible, even vital for defending the faith.
Which is why the link to the military in the Norse became so fast, so deliberate. I mean, these were really the first modern wars. They were defined by gunpowder, by siege warfare, not knights on horseback. You had to be, hyper-rational just to stay in the game.
Okay, give us some specifics. How did this mindset actually translate into military tech?
We'll start with geometry. Suddenly designing fortifications wasn't just about building thick walls. It had to be mathematically precise, bastion forts and angled walls. And calculating artillery trajectories, pure geometry and physics became absolutely essential for actually breaching those new complex fortresses. So surveying and geometry became core military skills. We also see direct funding for innovation, like optics. Think about Galileo. He faced issues in the Catholic South, right? But telescopes and later simpler field glasses were quickly grabbed by Protestant powers like the Dutch for reconnaissance. That changes intelligence gathering completely.
And the manufacturing side, too. Metallurgy. That often gets overlooked, but better cannons matter.
Oh, it was absolutely vital. You couldn't rely on just sort of artisanal guesswork anymore. For a cannon to be reliable, accurate, not blow up in your face, you needed science. Our sources show a real push towards standardizing iron casting, specifically making sure the wall thickness and the bore size were consistent. It sounds technical, but that refinement meant safer cannons, more accurate cannons. It's rational diligence applied directly to gunpowder.
So the big takeaway for the Protestant territories, science wasn't just interesting, it was an institutional weapon, required for survival. And they had the philosophical framework ready to embrace it.
Yes, a survival mechanism that also started building an economic advantage. But now let's pivot. Let's look at the center, the Holy Roman Empire, led by the Catholic Habsburgs. If science was so crucial, why couldn't they just adopt it across the board?
We mentioned the HRE was structurally weak, this nominal empire with hundreds of states. What did that mean for its military, practically speaking?
It meant the emperor simply couldn't maintain a single professional standing army loyal to the state. Why? Because the local princes guarded their own power jealously. They wouldn't fund a strong central imperial force that might challenge them. So instead, the HRE had to rely massively on mercenaries.
The famous example being Albrecht von Wallenstein.
Exactly. Wallenstein is the perfect example of this system. He wasn't just a general, he ran this enormous war business.
Mm-hmm.
He had a huge private army funded not by the emperor really, but by his right to plunder territories and levy taxes wherever he went. Now, short term. Incredibly effective. Wallenstein was, frankly, terrifyingly successful for a time, but long term. It was unstable, inefficient. His soldiers were loyal to him and the promise of loot, not really to the HRE or even the Catholic cause itself.
Hold on. So this major general in the quote-unquote religious wars is basically running a giant, mobile, self-funding corporation. That kind of undermines the idea of a purely faith-driven conflict, doesn't it?
Yeah.
But okay, even with these weaknesses, didn't they just have huge manpower? Didn't tradition count for something against these northern upstarts?
In the short run, yes, sometimes. Sheer numbers can make a difference. But the inefficiency, the lack of standardization, the eventual mutinies when pay dried up, it proved fatal in the long run. And compounding this was the difference in educational philosophy. The HRE relied on its established universities, which were rooted in scholastic philosophy.
Okay, for listeners maybe not up on their 17th century academic trends, what does scholasticism mean here? Why does it matter?
Well, scholasticism really prioritized theoretical debate, theological arguments, and the authority of ancient texts, think Aristotle. This meant that practical, empirical fields like surveying, applied math, hands-on engineering, they were often seen as secondary, less important than theoretical knowledge. So while the knowledge of military science existed, it wasn't systematically embedded in the education of the officer class across the board. It stayed more of a specialist thing.
But the knowledge was there. I mean, sophisticated siege techniques were being used by Catholic armies, too.
Oh, absolutely. That's a crucial nuance. You see brilliant commanders like Ambrogio Spinola, the Catholic general who took Breda. He used highly rational, geometric, scientific siege methods. The knowledge definitely existed, especially in places like the Spanish Netherlands or Italy. But, and this is the key, it was often applied by exceptional individuals, not systematically absorbed and taught throughout the HRE's military and educational structure in the way it was starting to be in the North. There was a kind of systemic resistance, maybe symbolized by Galileo's troubles. Dogma or tradition often trumped widespread adoption of empirical methods.
Right, and this is where it gets really fascinating for me. The difference wasn't just slightly better tech here or there. It was about the efficiency that comes from standardization.
Yeah.
That feels very modern.
Look at the guns they were using, the small arms. The Imperial Army mostly used the matchlock musket. Now, a matchlock, you had this slow-burning cord, the match, that you had to keep lit, and you physically touched it to an open pan of powder to fire. It means it was slow to load, fiddly, basically useless if it rained, and you had this burning cord near loose powder all the time. A logistical nightmare and dangerous. Now, contrast that with the Protestant forces, especially the Dutch and Swedes. They moved much faster towards the flintlock. The flintlock mechanism was self-contained, used flint and steel to make a spark. It was faster, more reliable in bad weather, and safer. That drastically improves your rate of fire and dependability on the battlefield.
And this standardization idea went beyond just muskets, right?
Yeah.
Cannons, logistics.
Absolutely. The Dutch and Swedes started standardizing their artillery calibers. That means a 12-pair cannonball fits any of their 12-pound cannons. Sounds simple, right? But the imperial forces often had this chaotic mix of different cannon sizes and types. Imagine trying to resupply that mess in the field. Standardization might seem boring, but honestly, it's the bedrock of modern military logistics and power.
And the formations, how they actually move the troops. That sounds like applied geometry, too.
It absolutely was. Leaders like Maurice of Nassau in the Dutch Republic, they weren't just throwing feudal levies into big blocks anymore. He used geometry to standardize company formations, drilling. He introduced systems like the countermarch. That's where the front rank fires, then immediately marches to the back to reload while the next rank steps up and fires. It requires precise timing, discipline, standardized drills, continuous fire, pure rational mechanics applied to infantry.
So on the other side, the Catholic side, you still largely had this decentralized command, mercenary generals worried about their bottom line, maybe relying more on sheer numbers, prestige, and hoping for divine will rather than these standardized, scientifically optimized tactics.
That's a good summary. The superiority wasn't just about having a slightly better weapon in isolation. It was the whole system. It was the institutionalization of scientific thinking throughout the military structure, from the guy casting the cannon to the officer planning the maneuver. And the HRE just couldn't match that system-wide efficiency, mostly because it was so fragmented politically, and partly due to that ideological hierarchy. that valued tradition sometimes over practical application.
Okay, this brings us to the cultural engine underneath all this.
Yeah.
Literacy. How does basic education, reading and writing, play into this military and economic split? Because standardized logistics, reading orders, calculating supplies, following complex drills,
Yeah.
that all needs standardized people, right? People who can read and calculate.
This might be the most profound factor in the long run, the one that really cemented the economic divide later on. Protestant culture developed what you could call a more horizontal structure for knowledge. When Luther translated the Bible into German, into the common language, suddenly there was this religious imperative for ordinary people to learn to read, write, maybe do basic arithmetic so they could access the scriptures themselves.
Faith itself demanding mass education. Wow.
Exactly, a spiritual goal driving a very practical, technical outcome. Our sources show literacy rates jumping significantly in the Protestant North. We're talking maybe 30 to 50% by the mid-17th century in some areas. That creates this broad base of literate, numerate people, the kind of workforce you need for standardized armies, yes, but also for more complex trade, administration, and eventually manufacturing.
And contrast that with the Catholic culture,
Yeah.
which maintained more of that traditional vertical structure of knowledge.
Right. The Catholic Counter-Reformation, partly in reaction, often doubled down on elite education. Think of the Jesuit schools, excellent education, but focused on training the clergy and aristocracy in Latin theology philosophy to maintain doctrinal control and consistency. For the masses, education, where it existed, tended to remain largely oral sermons, catechism ensuring the church hierarchy interpreted scripture. As a result, literacy rates generally stayed much lower in Southern Europe, maybe 10–15% in many places. Knowledge flowed top-down, from the educated elite to the populace. So you had one culture prioritizing knowledge to preserve God's established order, and another prioritizing knowledge to actively understand and therefore potentially change or optimize God's order. That difference became an engine for reform.
So let's wrap up this era of conflict. How did it all conclude, and what was the lasting political impact? We have to talk about the Peace of Westphalia, 1648.
Westphalia essentially ended the devastating 30 Years' War, and you could argue the real winner wasn't any particular state or religion, but the modern idea of the sovereign state itself.
It formally recognized religious diversity within the empire, basically. The local ruler decides the religion. Quis regio, eis religio. And it cemented the power of the individual princes, which really put an end to the Habsburg emperor's dream of unifying Europe under Catholicism. The state, not the overarching empire or the universal church, became the primary political unit.
Exactly. And this weakened, decentralized HRE just sort of limped along for another century and a half. It's important to be clear on when it actually ended, though. The Holy Roman Empire, this medieval construct, did not end in World War I. That was the later Austro-Hungarian Empire dissolving. No, the HRE officially ceased to exist in 1806.
So what was the final nail in the coffin for that 1,000-year-old title?
Napoleon Bonaparte. After his victories, particularly Austerlitz, and his reorganization of the German states into the Confederation of the Rhine, which was basically a French puppet, Emperor Franz II realized the title Holy Roman Emperor was meaningless. So he formally abdicated the imperial crown in August 1806. That was the end. He then consolidated his own hereditary lands into the new, secularized Austrian Empire.
Right. So the final implication here maps out this incredible 400-year trajectory. This Protestant cultural foundation, the emphasis on rationality, perhaps thrift, universal education, institutionalized technology, it created fertile ground for highly organized, efficient states like Prussia and eventually the UK to rise. And these regions then became the powerhouses of the Industrial Revolution, which really locked in that North-South European economic and technical divide well into the 19th century and beyond.
It's a really quite stunning historical chain reaction, isn't it? You see this God-knowing reason, born out of theological necessity, slowly transforming into world-moving reason, the engine of the modern industrial and bureaucratic state.
So, the way people accessed and used knowledge was it filtered vertically through an elite or spread horizontally among the population. That difference seems to have shaped state power, military success, and ultimately industrial wealth for centuries. Which leaves us with a thought for you to consider. What kinds of structural barriers to knowledge sharing exist in our world today? And what modern tools or technologies, maybe AI, maybe decentralized networks, who knows, might act like today's equivalent of that local language Bible or that essential geometry textbook for empowering people on a mass scale? Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
This program is provided by Universal Genesis.